The morning air was crisp as mother guided her tiny 3-year-old through the heavy wooden doors of the county courthouse. The building loomed like a silent sentinel over the downtown streets, its columns tall and intimidating, casting long shadows over the stone steps. People hustled past, lawyers in crisp suits briskly heading toward the courtrooms, clerks carrying stacks of paperwork, and a handful of spectators craning their necks to catch glimpses of the day's proceedings. The chatter of hurried footsteps echoed through the marble halls, mingling with the distant clang of metal doors and the occasional bark of a police dog from a nearby holding area. Clutching her mother's hand with tiny fingers, looked up at the towering ceilings with wide-eyed wonder. She wasn't entirely sure why she was there, only that her father, who had been so worried and quiet at home, was going to be part of something big. Whispered softly to her daughter, "Stay close to me, sweetheart. It's just for a little while." Nodded solemnly, her curls bouncing as she followed her mother's careful steps, her tiny sneakers squeaking against the polished floors. The courtroom itself was a blend of formal gravity and understated intimidation. Dark oak benches stretched in neat rows toward the judge's bench, which stood elevated like a throne over the entire space. Sunlight streamed through tall, narrow windows, illuminating dust motes that danced lazily in the air. At the front, behind a glass partition, sat a K-9 police unit, a large German shepherd named Rex, alert and immaculately trained, sitting perfectly obedient beside Officer Martinez, his handler. The dog's sharp ears twitched as he scanned the room, his dark eyes unblinking, muscles coiled with the discipline that comes from years of service. His gaze wandered immediately to the dog. Something about the way Rex sat, so calm yet aware, seemed to hold her attention completely. She stopped mid-step, tugging gently at her mother's hand. "Mommy doggy," she said softly, pointing a tiny finger toward Rex, glanced down, amused by her daughter's curiosity. "Yes, sweetheart, that's a police dog," she whispered. Lips formed two tiny words she would not have understood the significance of. "Save him." The words barely reached ears, but repeated them, louder this time. "Save him," she said clearly, her gaze unwavering. Froze, heart skipping a beat. She glanced nervously around. The courtroom was slowly filling. Jurors were taking their seats, lawyers organizing their notes, and the judge had not yet arrived. A murmur of curiosity rippled through the few spectators who noticed the small child's quiet declaration. At the defendant's table sat Father Michael, his hands nervously clasped together, knuckles white. He had been packing outside before entering, trying to steady his breathing, and now his heart leapt when he heard words, though he wasn't sure why. His eyes searched for her, finally resting on her tiny figure standing beside her mother. For a moment, all of his anxieties, the looming trial, the fear of public scrutiny, the potential for serious consequences, faded, replaced by a flicker of hope sparked by a 3-year-old's innocent plea. The K-9 officer, noticing the intense focus on Rex, bent slightly to the dog. "Rex, stay," he murmured, his voice calm but commanding. The dog's head tilted slightly, ears twitching, but he remained seated, watching as if he could understand her intent. The courtroom staff and early arriving jurors exchanged confused glances. It was unusual for anyone to affect a police dog in such a direct manner, let alone a tiny child barely tall enough to see over the benches. As more people filed in, the room grew charged with tension. Reporters with notepads and cameras hovered near the back, sensing that something remarkable might happen, though they could not have predicted what. Oblivious to the curious stares and whispered comments, continued to point at Rex, repeating, "Save him." Her voice, though soft, carried an uncanny conviction. The K-9 handler observed quietly, noting the unusual intensity of the child's gaze. It was as if she somehow sensed the importance of the situation, the gravity that adults could only understand abstractly. Knelt beside her daughter, brushing a curl from her forehead. "Sweetheart, let's sit for a moment," she whispered, guiding to a small seat in the corner reserved for family. But attention never wavered from the dog. Her tiny fingers continued to point, her lips forming the same two words that seemed to resonate with an invisible weight throughout the room. Jurors, staff, and even the bailiffs began to notice. The whispered words were no longer just the utterances of a curious toddler. They carried a weight, a strange gravitas that none of the adults could quite explain. Michael sat frozen, heart-pounding. He had expected a tense, formal trial, not this surreal scene. Seeing his daughter, barely 3, take such an active role, even unknowingly, in the atmosphere of the courtroom was both alarming and strangely comforting. The air in the room seemed to shift, thickening with anticipation and curiosity. Every adult felt a strange sense of awe. What could a child possibly know? Yet something instinctual told everyone that words were not ordinary. They carried meaning, a kind of instinctive insight that only a child, and perhaps a pure-hearted animal, could sense. As the judge entered, the room fell silent. She approached the bench with measured steps, her robe swishing softly against the polished floor. Her eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on before moving to the rows of jurors. Papers shuffled, lawyers straightened ties and adjusted notes. But the judge's gaze returned involuntarily to the child, noticing the intensity of her stare, the repetition of the words, and the way Rex's posture subtly shifted in response. Something remarkable was happening, something that transcended ordinary courtroom dynamics. The judge cleared her throat, beginning her usual ceremonial opening, but her voice carried a hint of curiosity as she glanced again at. "Let's proceed," she said, though her mind lingered on the unusual scene. Michael's pulse quickened as the formalities began. He tried to focus on the proceedings, but all he could think about was the tiny figure of his daughter, pointing at a police dog with an awareness far beyond her years. Seated beside him, kept a protective hand on his knee, watching the unusual interaction unfold silently. Even before any testimony began, the courtroom was alive with unspoken tension, curiosity, and anticipation. Every adult present was acutely aware that something extraordinary was occurring. A 3-year-old, standing confidently beside her mother, speaking 2 words that seemed to reverberate through the room. "Save him." And though no one yet understood the significance, the subtle connection between child and K9 hinted at a series of events that would shock everyone present, change the mood of the trial, and alter the outcome in ways no one could have imagined. His voice, small but unwavering, had already begun to ripple through the room, setting the stage for a courtroom drama that no adult, however prepared, could have anticipated. In that moment, a single, innocent phrase from a 3-year-old transformed the courthouse from a place of rigid procedure into a space of wonder, curiosity, and quiet tension. The trial, though formally, now carried an undercurrent of something far more mysterious and powerful, an unspoken alliance between innocence, instinct, and trained discipline that would soon leave the entire courtroom astonished. The trial had barely begun, yet the atmosphere in the courtroom had already shifted. Lawyers shuffled papers, preparing to present opening statements, but every adult's attention was drawn, repeatedly, to the tiny figure of. She remained seated in the corner beside her mother, her eyes locked unwaveringly on Rex, the police dog. The dog's ears twitched, head tilting slightly in acknowledgement of the child, a rare and unexpected sign of engagement. Officer Martinez, who had handled Rex for years, felt a prickle of unease. He had never seen the dog respond this way in any public setting. 3 years old continued to whisper her 2 words, "Save him." Though soft, the words carried a clarity that demanded attention. Spectators in the gallery leaned forward, trying to make sense of the child's strange confidence. Some smiled quietly, attributing it to innocent imagination. Others whispered in disbelief, exchanging incredulous glances. How could a toddler grasp the gravity of a courtroom filled with adults debating the fate of her father? And yet, his unwavering stare suggested something beyond childish curiosity, an innate perception that unsettled everyone, even the hardened officers present. Michael, seated at the defendant's table, felt his pulse quicken. He glanced at, then back at the judge. Was it possible that a child's instincts could influence the tone of the trial? He had hoped for fairness, but he had not expected this. He looked down at his hands, gripping them tightly, and tried to steady his breath. The courtroom, once predictable in its strict formality, now carried an electric energy that seemed to hum just beneath the polished floors. Every adult sensed that something extraordinary was unfolding. The judge, a woman known for her calm demeanor and sharp attention to detail, paused mid-motion, observing. She called the courtroom to silence, her voice steady but laced with curiosity. "Young lady," she said, leaning slightly toward the child, "do you wish to speak?" Hesitated, glancing nervously at her daughter. She's just saying what she feels," whispered. But's gaze remained fixed on Rex, lips forming the same words again. The judge tilted her head slightly, nodding the unusual intensity. "Very well," she said. "We'll allow a brief moment." The K-9 handler, Officer Martinez, stepped closer, kneeling beside Rex. "Easy, boy," he murmured. Rex, trained to protect, detect, and obey, sat without moving, but his dark eyes followed as though recognizing a command beyond verbal cues. The courtroom collectively held its breath. Spectators shifted in their seats, lawyers paused mid-note, and even the court reporter's fingers hesitated over the machine. No one had ever witnessed this. The calm, trained police dog seemed aware of a toddler's intent. Stood up, small feet shuffling over the polished floor. Her mother instinctively moved to guide her but shook her head, determined. "Save him," she repeated, pointing directly at Rex. The dog's head tilted again, ears forward, muscles tensing just slightly, but not in aggression. It was as if the animal understood her plea, a silent acknowledgement of her innocence and urgency. Whispers spread across the courtroom like wildfire. Spectators exchanged shocked glances, some murmuring, "How can a child do that?" while others whispered, "That dog, it's listening to her." The father, Michael, felt tears prick at his eyes. His little girl, barely 3, had stepped into the courtroom with a bravery and clarity he could never have imagined. He had expected anxiety, fear, and uncertainty, but he did not anticipate a moment like this. His child, instinctively and unknowingly, bridging a connection between human and animal that transcended the formalities of law. The tension in his chest eased slightly, replaced by a mixture of awe, hope, and disbelief. Even the seasoned attorneys were caught off guard. The defense attorney, a tall man with graying temples, exchanged incredulous glances with his colleague. "Did that really just happen?" he muttered. The prosecutor, typically calm and unflappable, paused mid-note, trying to maintain composure. His eyes flicked toward Rex, whose behavior was subtly shifting, signaling attentiveness and responsiveness not typical in such a high-stress environment. "It's unusual," the officer whispered, kneeling near the dog. "In all my years, I've never seen him respond this way. He's aware. He's listening to her." A hush fell over the courtroom. Jurors leaned forward, some frowning in concentration, others whispering softly among themselves. The gallery erupted in quiet murmurs, a ripple of curiosity and tension spreading like wildfire. Words, repeated in that tiny voice, carried a weight that adults could not ignore. "Save him," she said again, small but resolute, as if the fate of the trial depended on her insistence. Every adult present could feel the energy shift. This was no longer just a legal proceeding. It had become something remarkable, a collision of innocence, instinct, and trained discipline. The judge, regaining composure, called for a brief recess. "Let's allow the young lady a moment," she said, gesturing toward, knelt beside, brushing her hair from her forehead and whispering, "Sweetheart, that's enough for now." But's gaze never wavered and Rex remained seated, eyes locked on her tiny frame. The interaction was silent, yet every observer sensed the gravity of the connection. It was a moment, that explanation, one that would linger in the minds of everyone present long after the trial resumed. Outside the immediate drama, reporters began scribbling notes furiously. Camera operators their equipment, sensing the potential for a story that would captivate the public. Spectators, initially curious about a typical trial, now leaned closer, eager to witness every subtle gesture. Jurors shifted in their seats, whispering softly among themselves, acknowledging that the courtroom dynamics had changed. Even the bailiffs, usually detached and procedural, observed the child and the dog with uncharacteristic fascination. Something about words and Rex's response had transformed an ordinary morning into an extraordinary spectacle. Back at the defendant's table, Michael finally found his voice. He whispered a shaky, "Thank you," though she didn't comprehend the meaning. His heart raced, a mixture of relief and awe coursing through him. The courtroom was no longer merely a site of judgment. It had become a stage for a profound, silent dialogue between a child, a trained police dog, and the human adults tasked with weighing justice. The energy in the room was electric, charged with curiosity, empathy, and a subtle, unspoken respect for innocence. As the recess ended, the judge signaled for the trial to proceed. "Let's continue," she said, her voice calm but laced with the faintest trace of amazement. Jurors returned their attention to the proceedings, though their minds lingered on what they had just witnessed. Sat back down beside her mother, quietly observing, while Rex remained at alert, occasionally glancing toward the child as if confirming that the connection persisted. The courtroom had already experienced a shift in tone, a subtle but undeniable change that no legal argument or testimony could replicate. And so, as opening statements began, every adult present carried the memory of a tiny girl's extraordinary words. "Save him." Two simple words spoken with clarity and innocence had captured the attention of a trained police dog, the judge, the jurors, and everyone in the room. The stage was set for a trial unlike any other, a trial where a child's instinctive plea would ripple through the courtroom, subtly influencing the human hearts tasked with weighing justice, fairness, and the fate of her father. In that moment it became clear. This was only the beginning. The courtroom had settled, though the air remained thick with curiosity and tension. Michael sat rigid at the defendant's table, trying to steady his racing heart, while clung quietly to her mother's hand. But the judge, a woman known for her measured temperament and sharp intellect, could not ignore what had just occurred. Her eyes lingered on the tiny figure of, and the imposing K9, Rex, who sat alert yet calm beside his handler, Officer Martinez. Something about the scene ordinary expectation, an almost mystical alignment of innocence, instinct, and discipline that no adult had orchestrated. Clearing her throat, the judge addressed the courtroom, her voice cutting through the whispers and shuffling papers. "We will proceed with today's session," she said, though there was an unmistakable note of curiosity in her tone. Then almost impulsively she added, "However, I would like to understand this moment a bit better. Young lady, would you like to explain what you meant when you said those words?" Mother froze. She hadn't anticipated the judge addressing her daughter directly. She's very sensitive to animals," stammered, trying to explain. "She often understands things that adults don't notice." Courtroom murmured. Lawyers paused, unsure whether to object, while jurors leaned forward, intrigued. The judge gave a slight nod, gesturing to Officer Martinez. "Would you allow a brief interaction between the child and your K9?" she asked. The officer glanced at Rex, who tilted his head, ears perking slightly at the unusual request. "Under controlled circumstances," Martinez said cautiously, kneeling beside the dog. "Rex is trained for protection, not interaction with the public, but let's see." The judge nodded, signaling for to approach. Unaware of the weight her small actions carried, toddled forward, tiny sneakers squeaking softly against the polished wood floor. Her curls bounced as she walked, hand gripping her mother's finger for reassurance. The courtroom watched, breath held collectively, as she neared the massive German Shepherd. Rex, trained for detection, search, and protection, shifted slightly but remained seated. His gaze never left, dark eyes steady yet seemingly aware, acknowledging something invisible to all the adults present. A faint ripple of awe spread across the spectators, who whispered quietly to one another, sensing that this interaction was extraordinary. Michael's hands trembled slightly on the table. He couldn't understand how a 3-year-old could influence a professional police dog in such a setting, yet here it was happening before his very eyes. He tried to control his breathing, but hope surged through him, a fragile, delicate hope born from his daughter's courage and unspoken understanding. The defense attorney leaned over, whispering to a colleague, "This This could actually change the tone of the entire trial. Watch closely. Even the prosecutor, usually detached and methodical, sat upright, eyes fixed on the girl and the dog, a mixture of skepticism and amazement crossing his features. Stopped just short of Rex, raising her tiny hand and pointing. Her voice, soft yet resolute, repeated the same two words, "Save him." Rex's ears twitched, muscles tensing just slightly but not in aggression. He shifted subtly closer, maintaining eye contact with, almost as if recognizing the innocence and urgency behind her words. Spectators leaned forward, eyes wide, whispering in astonishment. The untrained connection between child and dog had transformed the energy of the courtroom. It was no longer just a formal legal setting. It had become a stage for something profoundly human and instinctual. Knelt beside, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "Sweetheart, be careful," she whispered softly, but ignored the caution, standing confidently, her gaze unwavering. The judge's eyes softened, recognizing that this small child had tapped into something beyond ordinary perception. She made a note to herself. This was not just a whimsical moment. It could affect the tone and perception of the trial, subtly influencing the way the jury and spectators felt about Michael. Sometimes, the innocence of a child carried a moral weight adults could not replicate. Officer Martinez remained vigilant, hand lightly resting on Rex's harness. "Easy, boy," he murmured, though the dog did not move away. Instead, Rex shifted slightly, settling into a calm, attentive posture, his eyes never leaving. Witnesses exchanged incredulous glances. Jurors whispered softly among themselves. Some speculated that the dog's reaction was purely instinctual, while others sensed something deeper, an almost human understanding, responding to the purity of a child's intent. The courtroom felt alive with unspoken acknowledgement that this was a moment that none present would soon forget. Michael felt tears prick at his eyes. His daughter, barely old enough to understand the legal world, had already influenced the atmosphere in ways that adults had struggled to achieve. The tension that had gripped him since entering the courthouse had begun to lift, replaced by a fragile, extraordinary sense of hope. Witnesses who had seemed stiff and rehearsed now appeared more human, their expressions softened. Even the jurors, trained to focus on evidence alone, seemed subtly affected by the innocence and sincerity displayed by a child whose understanding surpassed her years. The judge, regaining composure, called for a brief pause in the proceedings. "Let's take a short recess," she said, voice calm but carrying a hint of wonder. "We will allow the young lady to interact briefly under supervision." Spectators shifted in their seats, journalists scribbled notes furiously, and officers observed quietly, aware that the unfolding scene was extraordinary. Small and unaware of the attention she commanded, looked up at her mother. Smiled faintly, guiding her daughter gently toward a small area at the front, while the courtroom remained hushed, captivated by what seemed like an impossible connection. As the recess began, approached Rex under careful supervision. She reached out, tiny hand brushing the dog's fur. A subtle response from Rex, a gentle nuzzle, a small shift closer, caused a wave of astonishment to ripple through the room. Officer Martinez whispered softly, "He's never done that in public, not like this." Spectators and jurors alike exchanged glances. Something remarkable was occurring. A bond, silent yet palpable, had formed in the span of seconds, bridging the instinctive intelligence of a trained K9 with the pure intent of a 3-year-old child. Michael could hardly believe what he was seeing. His daughter's innocence and courage had transformed a courtroom filled with tension into something else entirely, a space of awe, curiosity, and unspoken empathy. The trial, previously a place of rigid formality and anxious anticipation, now carried the possibility of a subtle moral shift, influenced not by argument or evidence, but by instinctive trust and human connection. The K9's response to words had created a new dynamic, one that no adult could have engineered or predicted. Knelt beside, brushing back her hair. "Good job, sweetheart," she whispered softly, smiled, oblivious to the weight of her action, still gazing at Rex. The courtroom remained silent, every adult present caught between disbelief and admiration. Jurors shifted in their seats, their expressions softened. Even the sternest lawyers felt a subtle change in the atmosphere. In that moment, a child's simple words, two innocent, heartfelt words, had begun to redefine the emotional landscape of the trial. As the recess ended, the judge called the courtroom to order. "Let's resume," she said, voice steady. But every person present, witnesses, lawyers, jurors, and spectators, carried with them the memory of a 3-year-old's extraordinary intuition and the silent acknowledgement of a K-9 who had responded in a way that seemed almost human. The trial would continue, but the stage had been irrevocably changed. Small Voice had already begun to leave an imprint, setting in motion events that would astonish, move, and ultimately influence everyone in the room. In the quiet hum of the resumed proceedings, one thing was certain. This was no ordinary trial. The presence of a child, her innocent words, and a police dog's unprecedented response had shifted the atmosphere in a way that explanation. Adults, trained and experienced though they were, could not deny the subtle force that had introduced into the room. And as testimony began once more, every eye and every heart remained aware that the extraordinary could happen when innocence met instinct. The courtroom had settled back into an uneasy rhythm, yet the tension was electric. Every person present was acutely aware of what had just occurred. A 3-year-old girl had pointed at a trained police dog and spoken 2 words, "Save him," and the dog had responded in an unprecedented manner. Officer Martinez, kneeling beside Rex, could hardly conceal his astonishment. He had handled the dog for years, training him for countless high-stress situations, yet nothing had prepared him for this. The canine's focus was unwavering, almost unnervingly intuitive. Stood at the front, small yet determined, gazing up at the massive animal. Her tiny fingers wavered slightly in the polished courtroom air, but her eyes never left Rex. The K-9 remained seated, muscles coiled yet relaxed, as though assessing the child's intent. It was a subtle but profound display of understanding, an unspoken communication that ordinary logic. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, whispering quietly to one another. Jurors exchanged incredulous glances. Even seasoned attorneys found themselves momentarily speechless. Michael, sitting at the defendant's table, gripped the edge of the polished oak in front of him. His heart raced with hope, mingled with disbelief. Could a child truly influence events in such a tangible way? The air in the courtroom seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Witnesses who had arrived nervous and rehearsed now leaned in, drawn by the subtle yet undeniable connection between and Rex. The trial, once a formal, procedural affair, had taken on the texture of something extraordinary, almost magical. Officer Martinez whispered to the judge, "He's never responded like this before, Your Honor. I don't know why, but he's calm, focused on her. He's listening." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, curiosity mingling with professional caution. "Proceed with caution," she instructed, her voice measured, yet betraying a hint of wonder. She gestured to the defense attorney, who now faced the unusual task of integrating this moment into a courtroom that had shifted from formality to quiet amazement. Unaware of the tension she had created, extended her hand slowly toward Rex. The dog shifted slightly, eyes tracking her every movement. Spectators gasped softly as Rex lowered his massive head in a subtle acknowledgement. It was a gesture of acceptance, a sign that the K-9 had registered her intent and recognized her presence as non-threatening, even urgent. The subtle act rippled through the courtroom. Jurors leaned forward, murmuring among themselves. Witnesses paused, pens hovering mid-note. Even the media crew adjusted cameras, recognizing the rarity of the moment. Whispered encouragement to her daughter. "Good job, you're so brave," she murmured. Lips curved in a shy smile, but her gaze remained fixed. She repeated her words softly but firmly. "Save him." The dog's response was now unmistakable. His posture shifted slightly forward, eyes locked on the child. The subtle motion conveyed a readiness, a responsiveness that had never been part of his training for public court appearances. It was as if he understood the meaning behind her plea. An instinctive awareness of urgency filtered through innocence. Michael felt tears welling in his eyes. He had never imagined that a 3-year-old could wield such quiet influence. The courtroom, previously tense with the formality of legal procedure, had softened in an almost imperceptible but undeniable way. Witnesses who had been defensive now appeared more honest, their expressions softened by the innocence and sincerity of interaction with Rex. Jurors, trained to focus solely on evidence, found themselves subtly swayed by the emotional resonance of the moment. The room had shifted from strict decorum to a shared human experience. The judge observed quietly, her pen hovering over notes. This was unprecedented. Legal proceedings rarely allowed for the personal, the emotional, to alter perception in such a tangible manner, but here it was happening. The subtle bond between a child and a dog was influencing the courtroom environment, softening the rigidity that usually defined proceedings. She made a mental note. Sometimes, human intuition, especially that of a child, could carry a moral weight impossible to quantify. Officer Martinez maintained a gentle grip on Rex's harness. "Easy, boy," he murmured softly, though the dog had not moved aggressively once. Instead, Rex's body language communicated calm attentiveness and focused intent, unusual in a high-stress environment filled with unfamiliar people. Spectators leaned forward, some holding their breath, watching the silent conversation unfold. His tiny voice, barely above a whisper, carried more influence than the words of lawyers or witnesses. The courtroom had become a stage where innocence, intuition, and trained instinct converged. Michael swallowed hard, heart-pounding. This was more than a spectacle, it was an emotional turning point. The subtle interaction between and Rex had humanized the trial, introducing a shared empathy into a space that often felt cold and procedural. Witnesses who had been rigid and rehearsed now showed subtle signs of genuine emotion. Jurors, too, seemed affected. Unaware of her influence, had introduced a force that no adult could replicate. A pure, instinctive plea for understanding and protection. Tightened her hold on his hand. "Careful, sweetheart," she whispered, though barely registered it. Her focus remained fixed on Rex, repeating her words softly, almost as if chanting, "Save him, save him." The dog's ears twitched, muscles subtly shifting to mirror attentiveness. Even Officer Martinez leaned in, astonished. "I don't understand why he's reacting this way," he whispered to the judge. "It's not training, it's something else, something instinctual." Spectators whispered in awe. The K9, trained to detect threats and protect, had instinctively recognized the purity of the child's intent. The courtroom had become a rare intersection of innocence and instinct, where emotional intelligence and nonverbal communication outweighed formal procedure. Jurors shifted, whispers spreading quietly among them. Lawyers, though professional, could not help but be affected by the subtle yet profound display. The trial, once defined by strict adherence to legal rules, now carried the unpredictable energy of something deeply human. Reached out one final time, her tiny hand brushing Rex's fur. The dog responded with the slightest nuzzle, a gesture of acceptance and acknowledgement that left the courtroom collectively silent. Spectators exhaled, some wiping tears from their eyes. The subtle connection had communicated something far beyond ordinary words, an instinctive understanding that transcended language. Michael, watching in awe, felt a fragile hope take root, the kind that no legal argument or procedural motion could produce. The judge, observing intently, adjusted her notes. This moment could not be ignored. The child's actions had subtly transformed the emotional tone of the trial, creating a shared sense of humanity among witnesses, jurors, and spectators alike. Even the sternest professionals present could not deny the impact of the scene. A small girl and a massive K9, locked in a silent, instinctive dialogue that influenced every adult in the room. Returned to her mother's side, tiny hands clasped in her lap. Rex remained seated, attentive but calm, eyes occasionally glancing toward the girl as if ensuring she was safe. The courtroom buzzed quietly with whispered speculation and wonder. Michael exhaled deeply, the tension that had gripped him since entering the courthouse easing slightly. His daughter, in her innocence and bravery, had shifted the dynamics of the trial in ways that no adult could have orchestrated. And so, as proceedings resumed, the courtroom carried a new energy, subtle, profound, and inescapable. Quiet courage, paired with Rex's unprecedented response, had demonstrated something extraordinary, that even the smallest voice, spoken with innocence and intent, could resonate in ways adults could not anticipate. The stage was now set for further surprises, revelations, and a trial that would be remembered far beyond its legal proceedings. In that quiet, charged moment, everyone present, lawyers, jurors, spectators, and officers, understood a simple truth. Sometimes intuition, innocence, and instinct could wield more influence than experience, argument, or procedure. And in this courtroom, a 3-year-old girl and a police dog had just proven it. The recess ended, and the courtroom slowly regained its formal rhythm, but the atmosphere had changed irreversibly. Michael, seated at the defendant's table, felt a subtle weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time that morning, hope stirred in his chest, fragile yet undeniable. His 3-year-old daughter remained seated beside her mother, oblivious to the attention she commanded. Her words, simple, innocent, insistent, had already transformed the courtroom. "Save him," she had said, and the K-9's instinctive response had sent ripples through the room, altering not just the mood, but the emotional lens through which every observer perceived the trial. The judge, maintaining her usual composure, gestured for the attorneys to proceed. Yet even she could not ignore the subtle shift in tone. Jurors, trained to focus solely on facts and evidence, seemed unusually attentive, leaning forward in their seats, as if hoping to capture every nuance of human interaction alongside the legal arguments. Witnesses who had appeared stiff and formal now displayed subtle signs of empathy. Their words, though measured, carried a warmth and sincerity previously absent. The innocence of a child had introduced an emotional element that law alone could not provide. Michael's defense attorney, a seasoned man with decades of courtroom experience, whispered to his client, "Stay calm. But this could actually work in our favor. The jury has already witnessed something extraordinary." Michael nodded, swallowing hard, though his throat felt tight. He could hardly believe what was happening. His daughter, barely 3, had influenced the courtroom dynamic without even understanding the implications. He glanced at, who was quietly observing Rex, tiny hands folded in her lap. Even the prosecutor, normally calm and unflappable, found himself pausing mid-note. He had come prepared for a straightforward case, expecting to dominate the proceedings with facts and evidence. But now, the energy in the room had shifted in ways he could not easily counter. The subtle bond between and Rex, the dog's calm attentiveness, and the child's innocence, had injected empathy into a space that was usually impervious to sentiment. He sighed quietly, realizing that no amount of evidence could entirely erase the emotional impact of the scene he had just witnessed. Meanwhile, continued to watch the dog with unwavering attention. Though only 3, she seemed to sense that something important had occurred. She leaned slightly toward Rex, whispering once more, "Save him." The dog responded with a subtle nudge of his snout, gentle yet deliberate. Spectators gasped quietly, their astonishment barely contained. It was clear that the animal's response was not mere obedience. It was recognition, instinctively aligned with the child's intent. The courtroom had become a place of silent communication, where empathy and intuition carried as much weight as legal argument. Michael felt his chest tighten. The tension that had plagued him since arriving in the courthouse had eased slightly, replaced by fragile hope. He looked at his daughter, marveling at her courage and clarity. He had never imagined that a child's instinct could influence adults so profoundly, yet here it was happening. Witnesses now spoke with a renewed sense of honesty, their voices carrying subtle emotion. Jurors, too, seemed affected, their expressions softening in response to the quiet drama unfolding at the front of the room. The judge observed closely, noting the transformation in her courtroom. "This is highly unusual," she murmured to herself, though loud enough for the officers nearby to hear. The subtle bond between and Rex had changed the energy in the room, Legal proceedings often emphasized argument, evidence, and procedure, but here, innocence and instinct had reshaped perception in ways no one could have predicted. The judge made a mental note that this case would be remembered not only for its legal aspects, but for the extraordinary human dynamics that had emerged. Officer Martinez, kneeling beside Rex, whispered softly, "Easy, boy, good." The dog's behavior remained calm, responsive to his presence. It was unprecedented. The K9 had never reacted in such a controlled and focused manner during a public proceeding. Spectators, jurors, and even the attorneys leaned forward, collectively holding their breath. His tiny voice, gentle but insistent, carried a weight far beyond her years. She had introduced an intangible force, a moral, emotional, and instinctual element that altered the courtroom in ways no procedural motion could. The defense attorney sensed the opportunity. He requested a brief recess, allowing witnesses to reconsider their statements and giving jurors time to reflect on the subtle but profound shifts in the courtroom dynamic. The judge granted the pause, recognizing that emotional clarity might influence the fairness of testimony. Witnesses who had been hesitant now spoke with more sincerity, their words imbued with humanity. The prosecutor, though wary, acknowledged the influence of his presence, realizing that the child's simple actions had created a ripple effect that could not be undone. Michael exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. His daughter had done more than capture attention. She had humanized the trial, softened the tension, and reminded everyone present of the fundamental value of empathy. The courtroom, once rigid and procedural, now carried the possibility of moral clarity. Witnesses smiled subtly, jurors leaned forward with renewed focus, and even the officers could not deny the profound influence of a child's innocent intervention. The tiny phrase, "save him," had ignited a change that reverberated through every heart in the room. Oblivious to the magnitude of her actions, returned to her mother's side, quietly clasping her hands in her lap. Rex remained alert, eyes occasionally flicking toward the child, a silent acknowledgement of her presence and intent. The courtroom, though outwardly calm, buzzed with an invisible energy, a shared awareness that something extraordinary had occurred. Even the most skeptical attendees could not deny the subtle but profound emotional transformation initiated by a 3-year-old. The trial resumed, but the emotional undercurrent persisted. Witnesses provided testimony with unexpected clarity and honesty, influenced by the courtroom's softened atmosphere. Jurors remained attentive, occasionally exchanging glances that conveyed acknowledgement of the child's impact. Lawyers adjusted their strategies subtly, recognizing that logical argument alone could not outweigh the moral resonance had introduced. Even the media crew, tasked with capturing the events objectively, could not ignore the story unfolding before them. Michael felt hope growing. The trial, once a source of anxiety and fear, had shifted into a space where humanity and compassion mattered. He glanced at, who smiled shyly at the dog. The simplicity of her words and the purity of her intent had achieved what legal argument could not. They had altered the emotional landscape of the courtroom. It was a testament to the power of innocence and instinct, a reminder that even the smallest voices can carry immense influence when spoken with courage. The judge, sensing the extraordinary nature of the situation, maintained her composure but allowed subtle cues to influence the proceedings. Witnesses, statements were considered with renewed attention to nuance and character, not just facts. Jurors leaned forward, listening intently, weighing both evidence and the moral tone subtly introduced by the child. The courtroom, once solely a theater of law, had transformed into a stage where empathy, innocence, and instinct shaped perception as powerfully as any legal argument. Michael exhaled again, eyes brimming with emotion. His daughter's courage had shifted the trial's trajectory. Witnesses who had been hesitant now with sincerity. Jurors, previously distant, leaned into the proceedings with subtle acknowledgement of his influence. The prosecutor, though cautious, understood that the courtroom's energy had been altered in ways impossible to quantify. His tiny voice, soft, persistent, innocent, had introduced a force no one could resist. By the time the morning session ended, it was clear that the courtroom had changed permanently. Had not only captured attention, she had created an emotional and moral shift, softening hearts and influencing the perception of fairness. Michael felt relief mingled with awe. The trial had become more than a legal proceeding. It had become a human story, one shaped by a 3-year-old girl and a police dog whose instincts responded to innocence in ways no one could fully explain. As the courtroom emptied for lunch, whispers followed and Rex like an invisible echo. Spectators, reporters, and even jurors marveled at the unprecedented bond between child and dog. Michael, watching his daughter, realized that her small act of courage had transformed the atmosphere in ways far beyond the immediate trial. The day's proceedings, heavy with expectation and tension, had been irrevocably changed by a simple, heartfelt plea: save him. The lunch recess, the courtroom reconvened with a palpable sense of anticipation. The previous morning's events had not only made the day extraordinary but had permanently altered the courtroom's atmosphere. Jurors whispered quietly among themselves, their eyes frequently glancing at, and the K9, Rex, whose calm yet attentive presence seemed to anchor the room. The prosecutors and defense attorneys adjusted their strategies subtly, aware that the intangible but powerful influence of the child and dog had introduced a new layer of consideration into the proceedings. Michael sat rigidly at the defendant's table, hands folded tightly, glancing at his daughter and taking a deep breath. His hand rested reassuringly on Small's shoulder. Though the girl appeared calm and innocent, Michael knew the impact she had already made on the courtroom. Witnesses who had once been reluctant were now eager to testify. There was a softness in their demeanor, a subtle honesty that had previously been absent. The jury seemed more receptive, watching with a mixture of fascination and quiet empathy. The defense attorney rose first, speaking with renewed confidence. "Ladies and of the jury," he began, his voice steady, "I ask you to consider the full context of this case, not just the evidence but the character of those involved. This trial is about justice, fairness, and understanding. Sometimes insight comes from the most unexpected sources." He cast a glance toward who sat quietly, small fingers intertwined. The jury, already influenced by the earlier events, leaned in curious, their attention sharpened. Witnesses began to speak, and the difference was striking. A police officer, previously hesitant, recounted events with greater clarity, emphasizing procedural details but also noting the human impact of actions on the individuals involved. The child's presence, combined with the K9's subtle reactions, had softened the tone of testimony. Another witness, a neighbor who had initially been reluctant to come forward, now spoke openly about the situation, expressing concern for Michael's intentions and the circumstances that had led to the courtroom proceedings. Her honesty was palpable, the words carrying weight beyond mere facts. Michael's pulse quickened as the defense witnesses, the courtroom absorbing each statement with heightened attention, sat quietly, her eyes occasionally flicking toward Rex, whose posture remained alert yet calm. The dog's continued responsiveness to her presence created an unusual sense of stability in the room. The jurors, trained to focus solely on facts, found themselves subtly swayed by the atmosphere had created. It was a delicate but powerful influence, innocence guiding instinct, which in turn guided perception. The prosecution rose, attempting to maintain control, but even their witnesses spoke with subtle shifts in tone. A key witness, nervous and tense, faltered initially, then glanced toward. Her tiny figure, the repetition of her simple words, and the K9's calm attentiveness seemed to imbue the witness with courage. The testimony flowed with a human quality previously missing, an acknowledgement that the courtroom was not merely a site for argument, but also a space for moral consideration. Even the prosecutor noted the shift, scribbling in his notes with a slightly furrowed brow. Throughout the afternoon, the courtroom remained captivated by the subtle dynamics had introduced. She rarely spoke, only whispering softly to Rex at intervals, repeating her plea: "Save him." The dog's responses, small but deliberate, a slight nuzzle, a tilt of his head, focused attention, reinforced the impact of her presence. Witnesses, jurors, and even legal professionals could not deny the influence these two extraordinary participants exerted over the room. It was a reminder that human emotion, combined with instinctive understanding, could shape perception in ways formal argument alone could not. Michael watched, heart pounding, as each testimony built upon the previous, softening the courtroom in ways he had never imagined. He marveled at his daughter's innate courage and clarity. She had not intended to influence the trial. She had simply acted on instinct, responding to a situation with honesty and purity. Yet the effect was profound. Jurors were visibly engaged, leaning forward in their seats, whispering among themselves at times, and nodding subtly in recognition of the human dimensions being presented alongside the legal facts. Even the judge, typically reserved and impartial, appeared quietly moved. She observed interactions with Rex, noting how the child's presence seemed to shape the tone of the testimony. Legal proceedings are designed to be objective, yet the courtroom had transformed into a living, breathing environment where human instinct and empathy weighed alongside evidence. The judge's gaze softened as she scribbled notes, fully aware that its influence could subtly shape the ultimate outcome of the trial. Officer Martinez, ever vigilant, remained beside Rex, whose behavior continued to reflect attentiveness and calm. "Easy, boy," Martinez murmured quietly, though the dog remained composed, eyes following. Their silent communication, a mix of instinct, recognition, and trust, was extraordinary to witness. Jurors, spectators, and witnesses alike felt the tension melt subtly under the influence of these two remarkable participants. The courtroom had shifted from a procedural stage to a dynamic interplay of morality, innocence, and instinctive insight. As the afternoon progressed, a breakthrough occurred. A previously reluctant witness, a colleague of Michael's, rose to testify. Initially hesitant, she glanced at, her gaze softening. I want to clarify something," she began, voice trembling slightly. She recounted incidents demonstrating Michael's integrity and character, emphasizing his good intentions despite circumstances that had appeared misleading. Her testimony, though factual, carried a deeply human weight, undeniably influenced by the presence of Rex. The courtroom remained hushed, every word resonating with subtle moral authority. Michael's chest tightened. For the first time in the trial, he felt genuine hope that fairness and justice might prevail. Unaware of the gravity of her role, whispered softly to Rex, "Save him." The dog's response was instantaneous but subtle, a nudge and a tilt of his massive head that seemed almost symbolic. Spectators whispered quietly, jurors exchanged glances, and the courtroom's energy shifted further. The combination of innocence, instinct, and attentiveness had created a powerful emotional undercurrent. By late afternoon, it was clear that the trial had shifted in subtle but meaningful ways. Witnesses more openly, jurors observed with heightened engagement, and attorneys adjusted arguments to reflect the undeniable influence of presence. Even the prosecutor, despite his attempts at neutrality, acknowledged in private moments that the courtroom's tone had changed. The weight of innocence, paired with instinct, had provided a moral clarity that formal legal procedures could not fully replicate. As the session ended for the day, the courtroom remained buzzing with whispered speculation. Spectators discussed the unusual bond between the child and the K-9, while journalists took careful notes, recognizing the story's extraordinary nature. Michael, finally able to breathe, glanced at Anne. He felt a deep sense of gratitude, wonder, and awe. His daughter, through simple innocence and instinct, had transformed the trial from a standard legal proceeding into a profoundly human experience. The judge adjourned, her voice steady but reflective. "We will resume tomorrow," she said, "but let it be noted that this courtroom has witnessed something remarkable." Jurors filed out slowly, still absorbing the subtle but undeniable influence of Rex. Witnesses left with newfound confidence, and spectators lingered, discussing the events in hushed, reverent tones. Even the legal professionals recognized that the day's proceedings had been extraordinary, shaped in ways beyond formal argument. Michael hugged lightly as they prepared to leave. "I can't believe what she's done," he whispered, glancing at who was skipping slightly, oblivious to the emotional magnitude of her actions. Smiled softly, holding her daughter's hand. "She's just being herself," said, "but sometimes being yourself can change everything." Michael nodded, heart full of hope, knowing that the trial's course had been irrevocably altered by the courage and innocence of his 3-year-old daughter. As they exited the courtroom, Michael glanced back one last time. Rex remained seated, alert and composed, eyes occasionally flicking toward the child. It was a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed. In that courtroom on that extraordinary day, a 3-year-old girl and a police dog had reshaped the dynamics of justice, showing that sometimes innocence and instinct could wield more power than experience, procedure, or argument. The next morning, the courtroom hummed with anticipation. Word of the unusual events from the previous day had spread quickly. Journalists whispered among themselves. Spectators exchanged theories, and jurors arrived with a palpable sense of curiosity. Michael sat at the defendant's table, his hands folded tightly, heart racing. Clutched her mother's hand, her small presence a calming yet extraordinary force. Rex, seated beside Officer Martinez, radiated alert composure, his dark eyes following every movement. The courtroom, though outwardly formal, vibrated with an unspoken tension. Opening statements began, but the energy was different this day. Lawyers were acutely aware of the subtle but undeniable influence the child and dog had created. Witnesses spoke with renewed honesty, jurors leaned forward, and even the prosecutor seemed unusually cautious. Michael, normally anxious, felt a fragile sense of hope, a hope born not of legal strategy, but of the profound emotional impact it had already imparted. The courtroom seemed more human, more attuned to empathy and intent than any legal argument alone could achieve. The first witness called to the stand was a neighbor who had initially been hesitant to testify. She adjusted her papers nervously, but glancing briefly found a courage that had been absent the day before. I want to clarify something," she began, voice slightly trembling. "Michael has always acted with integrity. He's not the person others might believe from hearsay. He's compassionate, responsible, and he cares deeply for his family." Her words resonated throughout the courtroom. Jurors exchanged glances, subtly influenced by the sincerity, while spectators murmured quietly in agreement. Sitting quietly beside her mother, whispered softly, "Save him." Rex's ears twitched and he leaned slightly toward her, a gesture subtle but profound. It was as if the dog's focus reaffirmed the innocence and sincerity of the child's plea. Every adult in the room, witnesses, jurors, spectators, felt the subtle energy shift once more. A connection had formed, intangible yet undeniable, innocence guiding instinct which in turn shaped human perception. The courtroom had become a theater of moral clarity, layered with instinct and empathy. Michael's defense attorney sensed the critical moment. He rose, voice steady, speaking not just to the jury but to the humanity in the room. "Ladies and," he said, "this trial is not only about facts, evidence, and procedure. It is also about understanding, integrity, and character. And sometimes, insight comes from the most unexpected sources." He gestured subtly toward, who looked up briefly with wide, innocent eyes. The jurors leaned forward, captivated not only by the argument but by the extraordinary circumstances that had unfolded before them. The prosecution attempted to counter, but even their witnesses seemed subtly affected. A key officer, who had been nervous about providing testimony, faltered slightly, glancing at Rex. The K-9's calm attentiveness and the child's resolute presence seemed to instill confidence and sincerity. The officer proceeded, providing evidence factually but with an unexpected warmth and clarity that carried additional weight. Even the prosecutor recognized the influence of the child, scribbling notes and adjusting strategy quietly. Simple presence continued to shape the courtroom in ways that no procedural motion could. Each time she whispered to Rex, his responses were small but deliberate. A tilt of the head, A subtle nudge, attentive posture. These gestures resonated throughout the courtroom, silently reinforcing the connection between innocence and instinct. Witnesses, jurors, and spectators absorbed the energy unconsciously, their perception of the proceedings subtly colored by the child's courage and the dog's response. The trial had become more than legal argument. It was now a study in human empathy and instinctual understanding. Michael felt his hope grow steadily, mingled with awe. His daughter, unaware of the power she wielded, had created a force no adult could replicate. Every gesture, every whisper of "save him," carried meaning that rippled through the courtroom. Jurors, tasked with impartiality, found themselves leaning in, processing not only evidence but also the moral undertones it introduced. Witnesses spoke with a renewed sincerity, influenced subtly by the tiny figure whose presence had humanized the proceedings. The judge, observing the subtle dynamics, noted the extraordinary circumstances. "We are witnessing something remarkable," she whispered under her breath. Though maintaining professional neutrality, she could not ignore the extraordinary bond forming between and Rex, nor the emotional impact on the courtroom. Legal proceedings are rarely shaped by innocence and instinct, yet here it was unfolding in real time, a reminder that the human element can sometimes override strict procedure, influencing perception in ways formal rules cannot anticipate. As the day progressed, a pivotal moment arrived. A key witness who had initially provided testimony unfavorable to Michael approached the stand with visible hesitation. The room held its collective breath. Sensing the tension, whispered softly once again, "Save him." Rex's ears twitched and he leaned slightly forward, attentive yet calm. The witness paused, glanced at the child, then exhaled as if finding the courage to speak honestly. I want to clarify my previous statement," she began. Michael acted responsibly. He did not intend harm. He deserves fairness. The courtroom exhaled collectively. Jurors shifted in their seats, absorbing the testimony. Spectators whispered softly, astonished at the transformation in narrative. Even the prosecutor's expression softened, acknowledging the subtle but undeniable impact of the child in K9. Michael's heart raced. The small, innocent gestures of his daughter had begun to tilt the scales, not by law alone, but by infusing the trial with clarity, honesty, and human insight. His influence continued quietly but powerfully. Each time she whispered to Rex, the dog's reactions, small nuzzles, attentive posture, gentle tilts, reinforced the sincerity of witnesses. Jurors subconsciously absorbed these cues, their perception subtly shaped by instinctive signals. Michael felt a deep, surreal gratitude for his daughter's role. In that courtroom, innocence had become a guiding force, bridging gaps that evidence and argument alone could never traverse. By late afternoon, the trial had reached a critical tipping point. Witness after witness, previously hesitant, with renewed clarity. Jurors, influenced by the emotional undercurrent had created, appeared deeply engaged. The courtroom's energy had shifted dramatically. Formal rigidity had softened, replaced by moral attentiveness. The presence of a child, paired with a responsive police dog, had created an environment where truth, empathy, and instinct converged. Michael could scarcely believe the transformation. His daughter had subtly but irrevocably altered the course of the trial. The judge called for a brief recess, allowing all parties to reflect. "We will continue shortly," she said, her voice calm yet tinged with acknowledgement of the extraordinary dynamics. Jurors filed out quietly, whispering softly among themselves. Spectators lingered, talking in hushed tones about the bond between and Rex. Michael exhaled deeply, clutching his hand, his chest tight with emotion. The trial, once a procedural, had become a testament to the power of innocence, instinct, and human connection. As the courtroom emptied briefly, looked up at her father with a small, shy smile. "Save him," she whispered softly. Rex responded with a subtle nudge, his calm attentiveness echoing the sentiment. Michael smiled, feeling a swell of pride and hope. In that moment he understood the extraordinary truth. Sometimes the smallest voices, when paired with pure intent, can wield influence far beyond expectation. And in this trial, a 3-year-old girl and a police dog had done just that. The final day of the trial dawned with a sense of tension unlike any the courthouse had seen before. Word of the extraordinary events, the child, the police dog, the subtle shifts in witness testimony had spread outside the walls. Spectators arrived early, journalists set up cameras, and jurors filed in with quiet but attentive expressions. Michael sat at the defendant's table, his fingers interlaced, heart pounding with a mixture of fear, hope, and disbelief. Clutching her mother's hand, looked around the room with wide, curious eyes, unaware of the magnitude of her impact. The judge called the courtroom to order. Her voice was steady but carried a weight of acknowledgement. This trial had become unlike any other. "We are ready to proceed with closing statements," she said. Lawyers rose, each aware that while evidence and argument mattered, the emotional and moral undertones introduced by and Rex had transformed the proceedings. Witnesses looked on quietly, some glancing at, sensing her quiet presence had already shaped perceptions. The courtroom was charged with anticipation, as if awaiting a verdict that went beyond mere legal procedure. The defense attorney stood first, addressing the jury with a renewed confidence. "Ladies, and this trial has been extraordinary not only in its facts but in its demonstration of human character," he said, glancing subtly at Rex. "You have seen courage, honesty, and integrity, sometimes revealed in the most unexpected ways. Today, you've witnessed how the smallest voice, when paired with pure intent, can illuminate truth. Michael has acted with responsibility, love, and integrity, and the evidence, now weighed alongside the moral clarity presented, supports a verdict of fairness and justice." Jurors listened intently, some nodding subtly, absorbing not only the factual arguments but also the emotional resonance. The prosecution rose to deliver their closing, attempting to reassert procedural control. "Members of the jury," the prosecutor began, voice measured, "we have examined the facts, and though emotional moments have occurred, you must weigh evidence objectively. The trial must focus on reality, not sentiment." Yet even his words were tempered by the undeniable atmosphere created by Rex. Jurors appeared quietly contemplative, their attention divided between the facts and the moral tone quietly shaped by a 3-year-old child. Seated beside her mother, whispered softly once again, "Save him." Rex's ears twitched, and he leaned slightly toward her, alert yet composed. The gesture was subtle, but every adult present registered it. The courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath, waiting for the outcome. Witnesses exchanged glances, some smiling faintly, sensing that quiet courage had carried more influence than anyone could have anticipated. The trial, which began as a procedural exercise, had become a stage where instinct, innocence, and moral clarity intersected with justice. The judge rose, calling the jury to deliver their verdict. Silence enveloped the courtroom as the jurors filed in, expressions solemn yet reflective. The foreperson stood, holding the sealed envelope. "Your Honor, the jury has reached a unanimous verdict," they announced. The room went still, tension so thick it could be felt in every corner. Michael's chest tightened, hands clenched as he glanced at. The child, blissfully unaware of the suspense, tugged lightly at her mother's sleeve, still looking at Rex. The foreperson opened the envelope and cleared their throat. "In the case of Michael Anderson," they began, "we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Spectators whispered excitedly, reporters hurried to take notes, and Michael felt tears sting his eyes. Relief, joy, and disbelief mingled in a whirlwind of emotion. Small voice, her simple plea, and Rex's attentive response had played an unseen but undeniable role in the courtroom's transformation. The verdict, though grounded in law, carried the moral weight of the extraordinary events that had unfolded. Michael's attorney exhaled, a broad smile breaking across his face. "Justice," he whispered, glancing at Michael, and Michael rose, embracing and then kneeling to hug. "You saved us," he said, voice choked with emotion. Giggled softly, unaware of the gravity but pleased to see her father smiling. The courtroom, witnesses, and spectators watched quietly, some smiling, some tearful, moved by the power of innocence combined with instinct. The trial had reached its climax in a way no one could have anticipated. Officer Martinez patted Rex gently, murmuring, "Good job, boy." The dog remained calm but alert, acknowledging his presence with a subtle nuzzle. The silent communication between child and K9 had become the defining force in the room, a reminder that courage and instinct sometimes transcend logic. Witnesses who had felt a profound sense of resolution, jurors carried a heightened awareness of human empathy, and even the judge nodded, acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances that had shaped the trial. Reporters approached afterward, eager to capture the story. Cameras flashed, microphones extended, and questions were asked rapidly. Michael, holding his hand, smiled faintly. "It's not just about the verdict," he said softly. "It's about recognizing courage, honesty, and the power of a child's intuition. Reminded us all of that today." Spectators nodded, journalists scribbled notes, and the story began to ripple outward beyond the courthouse, capturing hearts across the city. Unaware of her role in the public narrative, simply skipped slightly beside her mother, hand in hand. Her tiny voice occasionally whispered to Rex, "Good boy." The K9 responded subtly, a nuzzle and attentive posture reinforcing their extraordinary bond. Witnesses and spectators alike watched in quiet awe, recognizing that the combination of innocence and instinct had played a pivotal role in humanizing the trial, shaping perception, and ultimately influencing the verdict. The judge called the courtroom to order one final time. "This case is concluded," she said, voice steady but with a quiet reverence. "Let it be remembered that justice is not only the application of law but also the recognition of integrity, courage, and character. Today, a child and a police dog reminded us all of that truth." The statement resonated throughout the room, a reflection of the unusual but undeniable reality of the trial. Michael held close, overwhelmed with gratitude and awe. The courtroom had been transformed, not merely by evidence or argument, but by the quiet courage and instinctive understanding of a 3-year-old girl and a police dog. Witnesses left the stand with new confidence, jurors filed out with a deeper appreciation for the human dimensions of justice, and spectators whispered in amazement. The trial, extraordinary in its events and resolution, would be remembered far beyond the legal outcome. As they exited the courthouse, Michael glanced back one last time. Rex remained seated beside Officer Martinez, calm and attentive, eyes occasionally flicking toward. The bond between child and dog had not only shaped a courtroom but also left an indelible mark on everyone present. Michael turned to his daughter, smiling through tears. "You did it," he whispered, giggled softly, brushing a curl from her forehead. In that moment, justice and innocence had intersected in the most remarkable way imaginable. The story of that trial, the child, and the police dog quickly spread across the media. Headlines captured the extraordinary nature of the events. 3-year-old girl in K9 altar courtroom, father found not guilty. Social media erupted with awe and admiration, celebrating courage and Rex's extraordinary response. Michael, though still processing the surreal experience, felt profound gratitude for his daughter's presence and the subtle, transformative power of her innocence. In the quiet moments afterward, as Michael walked through the courthouse doors, the gravity of the event settled over them. A trial had concluded, a verdict rendered, but the memory of courage, intuition, and quiet moral clarity would endure far longer. A child's 2 simple words, "save him," had shifted the course of events, reminding everyone that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest power. And in that quiet triumph, Michael realized the truth. Justice is not only the realm of law but also the preservation of integrity, the recognition of courage, and the belief that even the youngest among us can change the world.